Dynamic types meet smart conventions talk. Welcome also to the first talk session of this year's PyCon. I hope you all have a great conference. I am Brandon Rhodes. So I've been observing that the idea of Pythonic, what it means to write code that looks good and fits in Python, is continually evolving. I noticed this, and I noticed that Python itself, as though it's a living being, has been teaching us, when in the middle of last year I tweeted that in Python, when a function name is long and has too many args to fit on a line, I tend to, and here I made good use of Unicode and Twitter, I tend to, when it gets too long for the line, break before the first argument rather than waiting and breaking on the last argument. And Carl Meyer I didn't know anyone else in the community had this practice I'd come up with, said yes, and the next step is each argument on their own line, and never any indent longer than 4 spaces. Guess what it turns out I'd been doing for quite a while? I had been also splitting arguments one to a line when things got busy. Apparently, Python had been teaching both of us the same set of skills without us coordinating or knowing it. The background to that tweet is PEP8. It's a standard you should all read if you haven't, where the Python community has enshrined its general graphic design habits. It says things like, and this is why we often run out of room, limit all lines to a maximum of 79 characters. Did I say graphic design? Think about that. When you guys are writing code, if you care about how it's formatted, and if you're a Python programmer, and if you've read PEP8, you do care, then while you are writing code, if not in the rest of your life or career, you are a graphic designer and are thinking in terms of graphic design. In fact, that rule from PEP8 I just read is quite similar to this quote: anything from 45 to 75 characters is widely regarded as a satisfactory length of line for a single column page. The 66-character line, counting both letters and spaces, is widely regarded as ideal. This is a famous standard that already existed in typesetting, but people often quote Robert Bringerst in The Elements of Typographic Style. In the same way that a graphic designer thinks about how things get unreadable as they get too wide, so PEP8 might be called our Elements of Pythonic Style, making us think about how to graphically design the code that we have to look at, and so it ought to be beautiful. So how do we create beauty when we keep running into a finite page width? Carl and I, apparently, independently of each other, were taught by Python and by PEP8's view of beauty that it's kind of ugly when the third argument is a little too far to the right and we have to wrap it down with all of this white space beneath. If you do this to several function calls in a row, it creates this kind of jagged river of positioning because the third argument lands in a different place depending on the length of the function name. Much better is to break early, right after the opening paren, which is what Carl and I had started doing, so that we only had a 4-space indent going down the page. It's prettier, easier to read. And then we also, when there were large arguments, or many of them, had started breaking them one per line. Look at that last example there. Why do you think I put a trailing comma after message that's not technically needed? That is because the symmetry is very friendly to version control. If you've ever used the convention where the last argument doesn't get a comma, you note that adding a 4th argument means that it appears that the third argument has changed, when really it's just now been bounded by a comma. By putting that trailing comma in, then you get a version control history at the bottom where you can see that the third argument didn't change because a 4th argument was added. In languages that don't have the trailing comma feature, they sometimes move the commas to the beginning of the next line to avoid this. That is ugly, and Python gives you a way out. Carl's tweet has gotten me thinking about how Python has been teaching different people the same things. I started thinking about this. You can go see the video for my Python Canada 2012 talk. Shout out to the Canadians for having an almost impromptu conference thrown together quickly that was incredibly awesome. Shout out to them for having another one this year in August in Toronto. And it gave me an outlet for putting together these ideas I'd started having, and I started with a talk called A Python Aesthetic, Beauty, and Why IPython. My most popular slide, I should go ahead and share with you, was this one. When I'm forced onto a third line by a particularly long argument, I sometimes just give it a name. If I'm going to have 2 lines anyway, the assignment doesn't damage me. It lets me keep all my code justified at the left margin, and it documents what that big expression sitting in the middle of the function call is. I adapted this idea from something called extreme programming. They were a bit crazy and had this philosophy, destroy all comments, and actually consider comments to be bugs. So if they had a call like this, where a comment had to explain a bit of their code, they would just add a name to the code to do what the comment was doing. So see my Python Canada talk for more about how coding involves graphic design considerations like this, where the indentation lies, and how you handle white space and very long lines. This maneuver of giving that string a name and then using the name in the call got me thinking away from graphic design and onto the general topic of naming in Python. T.S. Eliot famously started a book of poems with the naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I'm as mad as a hatter if I tell you a cat must have 3 different names, and so forth. He's British, so he's whimsical and crazy. So I'm going to suggest that the naming of ducks is a difficult and very important matter in Python. Remember, the term duck comes from the fact that Python does no type checking for us. We don't have to say which of our arguments are ints and lists. So we rely on duck typing. If I have a function, it's really just a list of arguments that have different transforms and operators applied to them, and it doesn't matter what type it is. If I didn't have variable names, you wouldn't know what these were. Is argument 2 perhaps a dictionary because I call .get on it? And if you ever rewrite a function to have no names like this, it really shows you how general Python is. Most the functions and routines you write are actually very general. They're not about what you think they're about. They will operate on any darn objects that happen to have the methods and attributes that you use in your code. It's only the names that tell you that I actually intended this to take a requests.session and to get its URL. Oh, whoops, it wasn't a dictionary at all. Other kinds of objects have .get and it means something different. But you'd never have guessed that without my variable names. They are your only guide to my intent. Names are how the Python programmer signals intent. Names are our lifeline. Names are all we've got. So if the internal logic of the Python language has been teaching us about graphic design, I started to ask, what might it have been teaching us about names? I have 4 suggestions that I've dug up in my first 2 or 3 months of watching the phenomenon. We're going to talk about well-factored nouns, relentless verbs, the sin of synecdoche, and the problem of pluralization. Well-factored nouns. I have done the following. It's going to sound silly reduced to an example this small, but this is in essence what I've done before. I've written an argument, and someone is going to give as an argument to it a web page, and so I save that in a variable called page and pass it to download page. I then get to download page. I use the requests library to get the page, and I should store that in a variable called oh, I guess that wasn't the page they gave me, was it? I guess that was actually the URL of the page, and it's only when I look it up that I get back the page. Okay, so now I'm straight. I have the page, and I can pass it to process page. When I get to process page, I ask the object what its .text is, and that is, oh, I guess that's the page. The page is its text. So what I actually am passing in here is a response object, and the page is the thing inside of that. What have I done? If I just write linearly like that, and then consider myself done. Remember, one of the biggest sins you can commit is to stop programming when it works. I wish someone could go back to like 1995 Brandon and tell him he's only about halfway done once his code works, because he now needs to read it over and over and start discovering that it's twice as long as it needs to be and is very confusing to boot. What I've done here is I've failed. I'm going to claim to refactor. That's going to surprise those of you who think that refactoring only involves the actual structure of the objects. Because remember, the names don't matter in Python. I'm not actually changing what the code does if I go and rename the arguments. But I'm going to argue that because names are how we survive, this is a form of refactoring. And this is confusing when you get something called page as an argument, but it gets assigned to a parameter called URL. And when you get something called page, and then it's getting stuffed into a parameter called response. Every time you run into a mismatch between how you've named something and what a thing is, I argue you should refactor and go rewrite your previous code to match the naming convention that you've discovered needs to be adopted. Then args URL gets passed into a parameter URL, and the same with the symmetry here with the name response. Learning that a name was imprecise is knowledge. Knowledge is scarce in programs. That's why we have bugs. That's why we make mistakes. That knowledge, once discovered, you should go make it available everywhere throughout your code. As an aside, you know that what they say that Python can never work because it lacks type checking like a real language. If you fail to refactor your names, well, do you actually have any sanity check for whether the argument page is the right kind of thing for the parameter called response? You really don't. But if you consistently refactor names, you get a kind of rudimentary type checking for free, because there will tend to be symmetry between the names of arguments and the names of the parameters down in the function definition. That's well-factored nouns. My advice, from having tried it both ways, is that you should exuberantly refactor by pushing name changes back into all your previous code. You can't control sometimes whether your names fit the parameters in the other libraries you're calling, because they might legitimately work at different levels of abstraction and just need different names. A big question is often, if I'm using a library and it calls something page, should I always follow that in my code or use what I might find a more sensitive name, a more sensible name? That can be a difficult call. Topic 2, relentless verbs. This is more of a guideline because I'm going to state it and then immediately tell you how many places it doesn't work. For stuff that does something, I find it clearer to use a verb. Remember from the Zen of Python, explicit is better than implicit. I have found that plain old functions work best if I find that they should, in almost all cases, their names should be verbs. If the function is called database, then one, it's often not clear to me what it does, and second, it steals the variable name that I would like to assign the result to. I always find that putting a verb at the beginning of my function names makes my code clearer and keeps the nouns free for the names that I use in the locals in my function. I told you there were some exceptions. Well, methods are often perfectly easy to understand without verbs. The parens help. Document.md5, I don't need compute underscore in front of that to guess what it does, because we know from the syntax of Python that name.name paren is pretty clearly to us noun.verb, and also it doesn't clobber the possibility of my saving that in a name md5 because it's in its own namespace. The methods of that document object are in their own namespace and don't interfere with what I call my local variables. What is the last and most exuberant of the Zen of Python? Namespaces are what?
One honking great idea.
Let's do more of those. I'm starting to practice just going up to Python programmers. Do this later tonight in the when everyone is drinking around the bar. Just go up to someone and say, namespaces are... That should be something we all know by heart. An exception I found is if someone uses new in front of a function name, it's pretty clear that it actually creates a new thing. From other object-oriented languages, people are often very familiar with the fact that new underscore obj is going to create a new object. So I often, it's fine. I understand the code just fine if it omits the verb there. And also, verbs can be too verbose for routines that are kind of math-like, that you're going to be using in big expressions. It's true that that if top is a function that computes a local maximum on a map, that it's kind of sad that I won't be able to save the result to top. But this is an old math convention. The name of the function in math class that computes a cosine is not called compute underscore cosine. It's just cosine. You've got to come up with another name to put the result into. That's how math works. That's how computation works. So that's probably how we should do our names to not create the redundant mess in the first example here. So relentless verbs. With those exceptions accepted, function names, I think, at least, should include a verb instead of simply naming what they build or generate. All right, this next one is interesting. I have come across something that I've decided to name the sin of synecdoche. In Lewis Carroll's book, Through the Looking Glass, the second Alice book, the retread, I guess, or sequel, Alice meets a knight who offers to sing. A knight because the first book was based on a card deck with the queens of the different, what are they called, suits. And the second book was based on a chess game, and so she meets a knight. He promises to sing for her and says the name of the song is called Haddock's Eyes. Oh, that's the name of the song, is it? Alice said, trying to feel interested. No, you don't understand, the knight said, looking a little vexed. That's what the name is called. The name really is the aged man. Then I ought to have said that's what the song is called, Alice corrected herself. No, you oughtn't. That's another thing. The song is called Ways and Means, but it's only what it's called, you know. Well, what is the song then, said Alice, who by this time was completely bewildered. I was coming to that, said the knight. The song really is a sitting on a gate, and the tune's my own invention. It turns out that that was a lie. The tune was a well-known one that Alice recognized, but the knight's attitude toward naming should be very familiar to you programmers, though strange though it might have seemed to someone in the 19th century. If you have a URL that is actually a string and then use it to fetch a song that is actually some text, don't you have the same situation? On the right-hand side here is a name and a song, but you need to give them names in your program, so you have what the song is called, which is different than what the name of the song is called in the upper left there. How did Lewis Carroll, writing in the middle of the 19th century, anticipate a problem encountered by programmers? Because he was a mathematician. His next book after Alice in Wonderland was an introduction to discriminants. His fans were disappointed. And mathematicians hundreds of years ago, especially when they started experimenting with different bases and the fact that 11 isn't the number, it's just one of many possible names for the number, they, hundreds of years ago, started realizing this difference between a thing and its name and what the thing is called and what the name of the thing is called, and we're already developing conventions to deal with that. So, the sin of synecdoche. Very often, it occurs because we confuse a name with its referent, or a property of a thing with the thing itself. It happens anywhere in your code when you say song equals, and it's not actually a song. Or when you say document equals or file equals, and it's not actually a document or a file itself. I've found that my code becomes much easier to reason about if I follow the following rule. Always name the part. I can qualify it with song URL or I can call it URL, but my variable name must include information about the part, or I, at least, will become confused. Feel free to allow the context of a name to absolve you of the name to need the whole, the need to name the whole. I'm claiming you have to name the part. You don't always have to name the whole. PEP 8 is explicit about this. The X11, an old C library, uses a leading X for all of its public functions, X this and X that. In Python, this style is generally deemed unnecessary. A surrounding module or class namespace can be the part bearing the responsibility for naming the whole. So while MediaLib, that handles many kinds of media, might need a fetch songs function, if the fetch call is in something specific like songlib, no one's going to be confused about what kind of thing it fetches, so maybe you can leave song out of the name. In both cases, again, name the part. Please call that parameter URLs in case I ever have to read your code. The logging module both gets this right. It's assumed that the kind of filter sitting in the logging module is a logging.filter, and gets it wrong. Good grief, what kind of record did I think would be sitting in the logging module? Short, unqualified names are wonderful in Python. Why? Because they leave the caller in charge of whether to qualify them or not. If a caller is only dealing with songs, they can just import fetch and their code is perfectly readable. If they're dealing with several kinds of media objects, they'll import songlib and always use that qualified name songlib.fetch. Simple names that rely on the enclosing namespace for context may give both of these options to the person using an API. So I sum up: avoid the sin of synecdoche. Be explicit about wholes and parts, but feel free to split a whole and part between the namespace and the name. As an aside, note that good Python programming is often about doing what you ought rather than what you can. This code will work where I print value in one module that comes out of nowhere. Oh, and that's okay. I'll avoid an exception by going in and setting a value from outside before making the call. I've seen new programmers do this. It works, but it's just something you oughtn't do. Writing good Python, it's basically a long exercise in propriety. So the sin of synecdoche: make names as specific as possible by naming parts in preference to wholes. Finally, this next and last and fourth point is one that I actually am not decided on. Here I'm moving into territory where I haven't settled on a recommendation, but I want to lay out for you the different positions. What is the problem of pluralization? Am I referring to the fact that someone's popular library took away a plural noun you could otherwise have used to great profit in your code? No, that is not the problem of pluralization that I'm talking about today. The problem, actually, it's a bit complicated. It has three prongs. Maybe that's why there's not one right answer. First is that Python offers, and this is much of Python's power, many rich data structures, which leaves the awkward question of which one lies behind a given plural. If I jump into the middle of some code that's raised an exception, it's not always easy to guess what a connections is, since there are different ways to make plurals in Python, if I can put it that way. Second, plurals are not always unique in the English language. And that raises the question of how to name the container if box in boxes doesn't work for your noun. And some people also, you'll jump into the middle of their code and there's a plural and you think data structure, and people are using plurals for counting. Connections could simply be 8. And there's very little in some cases you can do about that because Python programmers love brevity. That means in some cases we also love a bit of ambiguity or learn to get along with it, or are willing to purchase brevity with ambiguity and make the person read a bit more code to gain some context. Now, when I started thinking about this and brought it up on Twitter, I discovered that the Python community has inside of it its own anti-plural party. I asked, if you name a Python list full of person objects, people, then is a list of their ID numbers a people IDs or a person IDs list? Tavi Burns meta-answered me by tweeting that I had asked the wrong question. He said I shouldn't have named my darn list people in the first place. He always sticks with the singular and uses list for the list of objects, and so he's free to symmetrically say the singular name underscore in a particular attribute if he's created that list of things. I didn't expect to be meta-answered and to have been told I asked the wrong question. The anti-plural party, you see, says that you should always talk about the singular and then qualify it with the kind of way you're going to be aggregating the singular. I guess if you've built it and you just know it's a dict, you can use the type name, which makes the code very clear, if a bit verbose. But I'd say if you're writing a parameter name, you don't actually care if it's a list or a dict. What you care is if it's a sequence or a map. Someone could pass in some other kind of object. You shouldn't imply that they're bad people if they send you a dictionary-like object instead of a dictionary. And so I've come up with these conventions that I've been playing with for placing a lightweight constraint or a hint of a constraint on the kind of argument that I'm sent. So, as I've been thinking about Tavi's very interesting claim, I realized that he and the rest of the anti-plural party have a quite distinguished lineage. Note that the relational database best practice for decades has been to give tables singular names instead of, like the new database developer always does, plural names. It makes your ORM happier, it makes things symmetric, and it makes the SQL, if you write any, read much, much more cleanly. And I note this same convention arising in modern scientific Python code, which, to me, this almost looks magic, because it uses regularly singulars for what are really arrays. Because X is, say, an array of values between -10 and 10, you can just write, using all these operators they've written that operate on arrays, plot X as against sine of X plus 2 cosine X over 2. When I first saw that, I said, what are they doing? They're cheating. How can they just write like my math teacher and say plot X and f of X? But because vectors do element-wise operations, you can write mountains of code like this that look, because I would have written this, plot X list, comma, sine of X list plus 2, and I would have put list everywhere unnecessarily, because it's understood in scientific Python code that you're always operating on arrays, so I guess you divide your expressions by the word array, and it's not X array, Y array, Z array, it's just X, Y, and Z, and it looks like formulas for math class. It's very startling, but very, very beautiful, and the anti-plural party would lead you to very similar kinds of thinking. So, plural alternatives sometimes can't be avoided, so think about where you stand for when you next run into a noun that doesn't pluralize. Dictionary-like objects, I'm not exactly sure what you should do with. I like calling them a map, saying what the object is supposed to do rather than what its class is, but sometimes I just call it connections. Not decided on that yet. Don't do this. So, the problem of pluralization, still the Wild West. I have not settled on a single doctrine. I have a few seconds left, so here are 2 tidbits. Go look up Ned Batchelder's recent blog post, War is Peace. He points out that if a young programmer tries using YAML, he's going to, and doesn't know anything about safety and having your computer rooted, he's just going to find the .load method and use it, and you should never have safe underscore anything. The safe underscore version should be the default that the naive programmer will use. You should use the word dangerous for the one that will create arbitrary objects and root your server. My second tidbit. Use the singular when documenting a key and value. Often I just can't give a dictionary a long enough name to describe the key and the value, so I put a little comment. I noticed that if I say scientific names maps to vectors, I'm entirely unclear on whether each individual key is a list of vectors or a single one, so I always now factor out the plural and say, instead of keys and values, key and value, so that I know if the S on the end of the value is significant. Guys, there will not be a question and answer session because I have actually burned 30 of your minutes. Thank you very much for listening. Dynamic types meet smart conventions talk. Welcome also to the first talk session of this year's PyCon. I hope you all have a great conference. I am Brandon Rhodes. So I've been observing that the idea of Pythonic, what it means to write code that looks good and fits in Python, is continually evolving. I noticed this, and I noticed that Python itself, as though it's a living being, has been teaching us. When in the middle of last year I tweeted that in Python, when a function name is long and has too many args to fit on a line, I tend to, and here I made good use of Unicode and Twitter, the background to that tweet is PEP8. It's a standard you should all read if you haven't, where the Python community has enshrined its general graphic design habits. It says things like, and this is why we often run out of room, limit all lines to a maximum of 79 characters. Did I say graphic design? Think about that. When you guys are writing code, if you care about how it's formatted, and if you're a Python programmer, and if you've read PEP8, you do care, then while you are writing code, if not in the rest of your life or career, you are a graphic designer and are thinking in terms of graphic design. In fact, that rule from PEP8 I just read is quite similar to this quote: anything from 45 to 75 characters is widely regarded as a satisfactory length of line for a single column page. The 66-character line, counting both letters and spaces, is widely regarded as ideal. This is a famous standard that already existed in typesetting, but people often quote Robert Bringhurst in The Elements of Typographic Style. In the same way that a graphic designer thinks about how things get unreadable as they get too wide, so PEP8 might be called to, when it gets too long for the line, break before the first argument, rather than waiting and breaking on the last argument. And Karl Meyer, I didn't know anyone else in the community had this practice I'd come up with, said yes, and the next step is each argument on their own line, and never any indent longer than 4 spaces. Guess what it turns out I'd been doing for quite a while? I had been also splitting arguments 1 to a line when things got busy. Apparently, Python had been teaching both of us the same set of skills without us coordinating or knowing it. Called our elements of Pythonic style, making us think about how to graphically design the code that we have to look at, and so it ought to be beautiful. So how do we create beauty when we keep running into a finite page width? Karl and I, apparently, independently of each other, were taught by Python and by PEP8's view of beauty that it's kind of ugly when the third argument is a little too far to the right and we have to wrap it down with all of this white space beneath. If you do this to several function calls in a row, it creates this kind of jagged river of positioning because the third argument lands in a different place depending on the length of the function name.